Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. On this podcast, we talk about arts, politics, culture, sport, and anything else in between. Now, today's guest, we've met a few times, and he has at Battle of Ideas festivals and we've had debates on various things. It's an absolute pleasure to have her as a guest. It's Dr. Joanna Williams. Hello, Jo.
Hi, Chris. I'm really glad to be here and to be part of your podcast.
That's good. Most people will probably know who you are because I might have seen you on as a political commentator on GB News or BBC, etc. But for those who don't, can you just briefly explain who you are, what you do, and how you basically journey your life, how you came to this point?
So I began my career as a school teacher, moved from there into academia, worked at the University of Kent for a little more than a decade. From there, I've really moved into journalism. I write a weekly column for the online magazine Spiked. I write for The Spectator, The Telegraph sometimes as well, The Times from every now and again. I'm an author. I've written, my most recent book was How Woke Won. And I've written books on academic freedom in an age of conformity, and on feminism, women versus feminism. And I think those are the kind of three areas really that I'm most interested in: the kind of the culture wars, woke politics and how that shapes society, academic freedom and free speech issues, and issues around women, feminism, gender, family life. I also kind of spent quite a bit of time working in think tanks, and I've set up my own platform, which is Cieo, Cieo, where I publish mainly my own work, but give a platform to other people who've got interesting things to say as well. So kind of quite busy, but it's all good fun.
Okay, before we get into the crux of the interview, Cieo sounds like a very interesting name. Where's the origin of that name come from?
It's a good question. Everybody asks me that. So I think always you struggle for what to call these things. And I was playing around with a number of different ideas, and it was actually my daughter who suggested it. It doesn't stand for anything. People always think it must be an acronym, but it's not. It's a Latin word, and it means to ignite, to kind of to spark, to set in motion. And I thought those were all really great words for kind of ideas of what I wanted to do. It just felt when I first set this up kind of 2 or 3 years ago now, that there was a real turning point in politics. The Brexit referendum had happened. Boris Johnson had just been elected. We still had Trump in the United States, and there was just a bit of a sense in the air that things were changing, that we could push things in a new direction. And this idea of kind of sparking new ideas, setting new things in motion, I thought really kind of captured something that I wanted to try and do.
Okay, cool. And you speak about like the past with Boris and Trump, and the political landscape, even from a few years ago, has changed. But another climate that's changed a lot is education, in particular, especially being on the news for various reasons. This is going to be a difficult question to answer because it's so vast. But over the last decade, how would you say that education has changed in that time?
I think it is a very, very good question. And I think the way I see it is that things have kind of changed, and then they've almost changed back again in that time period. So much has happened. So I think if you were to go back almost exactly 10 years, really, I would say that for me, that would be quite a positive time in education. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of Michael Gove as a politician in many areas of political life. I think he was a really strong advocate of lockdown, which was something that I very much disagreed with, and ironically disagreed with it because I think it was absolutely disastrous for education and keeping children out of schools. But 10 years ago, he was really pushing through some reforms to education that I very much supported. In particular, he was a big advocate of subject-based knowledge and just kind of generally introducing higher standards into education and reinforcing some sense that actually if you have high standards of children, then they can strive to meet these high expectations. And I think a lot of people, particularly on the left, seem to think that it's very elitist to have high academic standards of children, that if you have a kind of big expectation that children will cope with difficult subject knowledge, then you're going to disadvantage the kind of poorer children in society, or children who don't come from kind of traditional academic families, or families who've been to university, where parents have been to university themselves. I actually think it's completely the opposite, and we really do a disservice to the least advantaged children if we don't have high academic standards and don't have subject knowledge, because middle class kids, upper class kids, they'll pick this up from the home environment. They're going to perhaps be taken to museums and art galleries and foreign holidays and all the rest of it. Whereas for kids who don't have those advantages, school, it could be a really transformative environment. And if you've got a good teacher and a teacher who's really enthused about their subject and high expectations, then that can really change people's lives and really kind of inspire and excite young people about knowledge. So I'd say 10 years ago, Gove was really doing something that I thought was incredibly exciting. Unfortunately, I think over more recent years, a lot of those changes have been overturned or rowed back on. And to me, that's a real tragedy for this current government, because personally, I'm not a fan of the Conservative Party. I don't think they've done that much which is worth celebrating. I think the only thing going for them is that perhaps other parties would have been even worse. But I think one of the things that they could have really celebrated as a success is some of the changes that they've made to education. So the fact that they've then now been responsible for overriding a lot of those changes and watering down the positive reforms that they've put in place, I think is tragic. And like I said, I think a lot of that really has happened over the past 2 or 3 years. With lockdown, I think schools were closed for far too long. We've now got shockingly high numbers of children absent from the classroom. And I think essentially education itself has become vastly politicised, and this has happened on the watch of a Conservative government. And I think they should be ashamed. I really do.
Yeah, you talked there about you don't think it's elitist to set high standards. So just as a lead on from that, do you think there's this soft bigotry of low expectations when it comes to education?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that really is the very, very best way of putting it. And you see it even in response right now to this idea of children being persistently absent from school, if you as a result, or have not really returned to full-time education since lockdown. Now, I think it was scandalous that schools were closed for such a long time, and I think it's very unsurprising that some children have not rushed back to the classroom. But what you see here is a massive social equality gap. Children from the most privileged households were right back at school. Children from in disadvantaged areas, poorer areas, are not back at school. But instead of really cracking down on this and saying, actually, do you know what, you need to be in school, you need to be in school to learn, to engage with the curriculum, to pass exams. This is important. We take you seriously as young people, and this is where you're going to get the best opportunity to kind of progress with your life. You see people are lining up, it seems, to write articles for The Guardian to say, oh, this is because they've all got mental health problems, or this is because they're on free school meals, this is because the parents are having to go to food banks, this is because the parents are unemployed. And really what they're doing is they're making excuses for not actually saying to these kids, we need you back in the classroom, this is where you need to be, you actually need to be learning. They're making excuses for bad behaviour, for keeping them out of school. And I think it's shocking. And I think when you talk about education, there's a danger everybody begins to get a bit autobiographical about it. But certainly, it's education that's got me to where I am today, and really been transformative for my life. And I wouldn't want to deny other young people those opportunities as well.
I've heard you talk a lot, and not just yourself, but others talk about what you call this woke indoctrination in schools and universities. Obviously, we can talk about that and say what are your thoughts on that in summary. But also, do you think it points to a wider problem in that schools, not just it's almost by diktat, i.e., this is what happened and this is what you have to learn, instead of encouraging critical thinking? Do you think there's a wider problem in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I would separate out those things. I'm actually not opposed to just saying to children, particularly younger children, this is what you have to learn. You know, I think obviously I think critical thinking is really important, but I think you can't do critical thinking in the abstract. And I think a lot of teachers nowadays, or it's kind of quite fashionable in education, to try and get children or teachers think they're getting children to kind of engage in critical thinking before they've actually got anything to think critically about. So I think unless you've got a solid basis of knowledge about a particular subject, unless you've read a few books, for example, in literature, you can't really compare anything to anything else. You can't start drawing those joining dots or making connections between different ideas. So this idea that, you know, as a teacher, you can go in the classroom and start with a blank piece of paper and say to the kids, right, we're going to do critical thinking today, you know, it just doesn't work. So I think actually, as a way to make critical thinking possible, actually starting by saying, do you know what, you're going to have to sit down, shut up, listen to me, I'm the teacher, I know something that you don't, and I know something that's really exciting, really interesting, really important for you to know it, and you're going to listen to me and you're going to engage with this and you're going to learn it, and you're going to go home at the end of the day knowing more than you arrived at school this morning knowing. And when we've done that for kind of a few months or even a few years, then you're going to have a basis for thinking critically about the different ideas which you've kind of come to master. So I would see the two as going very much hand in hand. And I think the problem is nowadays teachers, like I said, some teachers anyway, think they can do critical thinking without teaching subject knowledge. But also what they mean by critical thinking, I think is a bit disingenuous, because people often talk about critical thinking when what they really mean is accepting the views and the values that I've given you. So, for example, if you take the issue of gender, you know, to me, critical thinking would mean a child kind of reading or being taught about trans women are women, trans men are men, and actually being able to say, do you know what, miss? I think there are male and females, and that for me would be critical thinking in that context. I think the problem is a lot of teachers see critical thinking as just reciting back to the teacher the kind of received platitudes, you know, the kind of woke mantras, if you like, that they've been taught, and it's not really critical thinking at all. It's just actually real kind of intellectual conformity, political conformity.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, we just talked about woke indoctrination there, and I do get your point of saying that, especially when you're young, there's certain things you're not going to know, and there's certain things where you do need to be quiet and have a bask of knowledge as well. I just wonder, has it always, obviously you could say it might be getting worse now, but has it always been an indoctrination affecting schools, in the sense that you're taught this and then you, especially in subjects like, I don't know, history, where you're taught this and therefore, and you should only listen to this? Or is it something that's only really crept up over the last 10, 20 years?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, that, and it's something I think about a lot, because certainly my own experience, which I'm sure, you know, it's not, I'm sure other people, I'm not that unique, I'm sure other people had the same experience as me. So I went to a Catholic school. I mean, it was just, you know, your bog standard kind of state school, but it was for primary school, it was a Catholic school. And you know, we were, the head teacher was a nun, you know, some of the other teachers were nuns. We went to church as the entire school. You know, we walked to church every Wednesday morning. There were prayers when we did our handwriting practice. You know, we wrote out kind of our Father, you know, for handwriting. And I look back at that and I think, you know, was that just a different form of indoctrination? And exactly as you've said, you know, was it the case that you know, what's going on today is just a different form? And you know, I'm not a Catholic, I'm certainly not a practicing Catholic. You know, I'm an atheist, so I'm not in any way a Catholic nowadays. And to a certain extent, you know, I left that school on the Friday, and by the Monday I'd forgotten all about it. You know, it wasn't something that had gone. Obviously, whilst I was at the school, I was a very good Catholic girl and I really believed everything I was being taught, but then it only seemed to go so far. And I think two things made that possible for me to do that. One is that, you know, there was kind of the school and the school values, but then there was also society and kind of a different set of values that seemed to be out there in society. You know, the rest of the world wasn't making me go to church and, you know, kind of preaching about Catholicism. I wasn't in that kind of world outside of school. And also the subjects that I was taught, you know, were separate to religion. There was like a sense that the religious bit was, like I say, Wednesday morning assembly, you know, odd little pictures on the walls and handwriting practice. But when you learned geography or maths or other things, you know, it was separate from that. And I think things that are a little bit different today, I think far more today, the values do actually seep in and become part of the subject knowledge that children are actually taught. So it kind of really, it's very difficult to make a distinction. It's not like, you know, you just kind of learn progressive values on a Wednesday morning. It will be every aspect of the school day. And what you're being taught very much matches up with the dominant culture outside of the school as well. So there isn't that kind of, I mean, for me, again, to go back to what we were saying about critical thinking, you know, critical thinking, I think, certainly for me, you know, hinges upon that sense of almost being able to make yourself into an outsider in certain situations, you know, where you can see that, you know, here's one kind of belief system and here's another belief system, and you can kind of set those up as two kind of opposing things, and that really makes you start questioning where you fit in. And I think the problem is when the values of the school match so closely with values that are there kind of quite dominant within the kind of the media that children will engage with, kind of the films and TikTok videos and the music they listen to, and all these things are very much aligned. It makes it much more difficult, I think, for them to position themselves as kind of outsiders and really begin to question this. And when that's infiltrated through every aspect of school life, again, I think it makes it more difficult to then be able to kind of just leave that behind and either question it or move on to something else.
So what you've just said there, obviously you explained very eloquently as well. However, just before I started recording this, there's an article you recently wrote in Spiked, where you talk about Rishi Sunak, and you basically, it's not a whole article, but there's a last section where you talk about this sake of education for education's sake. So going back to what you said in your previous answer about the values, would it be harder to teach those values when you just see education for education's sake and you don't see about what the surrounding values you learn outside of the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to say in the article I've written for Spiked about universities is really about the importance of knowledge and the kind of centrality of knowledge to the curriculum. Now, you know, to me, naively, sometimes I think that sounds quite a straightforward thing. But obviously, the question that people often pose to me is kind of what knowledge, whose knowledge, you know, who's deciding what counts as knowledge in the classroom or not. And you know, that these are really important questions, and I guess I would prefer teachers to be answering those questions and subject specialists to be answering those questions, rather than political activists or people with more of a political agenda, which is what I worry is happening in some subjects right now. But I think probably I would disagree with some of what's put forward as what counts as knowledge. But I think perhaps the important thing is to actually pose that as a question, you know, exactly as you have done, and actually talk about what should children be taught, you know, what should be part of the history curriculum, and actually have these as almost as a public debate. We want to be talking about these things as a society, and not just accepting that there's only one view of history. You know, even my view is not the only view or the right view, but actually kind of have some kind of discussion about what do we mean, you know, what is it, what view should children be taught, you know. But again, to come back to what I was saying about actually teaching a body of content coming prior to critical thinking, I actually think there's been big moves away from a kind of a sense of history, that a national story sense of history, and very definite moves away from any sense of kind of national pride in history teaching. And there is a part of me thinks that is a shame for young people, for children, because, you know, history can, and I don't, you know, I don't think we should just dress things up and only tell people the good things. And, you know, I think having some sense of balance is important. You know, absolutely, children need to be taught about empire, you know, to be taught about slavery, you know, they and Britain's role in the slave trade and Britain's role in empire. You know, I think those things are absolutely important. But I think what the danger is when we teach only a kind of negative sense, that only bad things happened in the past, because I think you risk giving, for one thing, that's not balanced, you know, and it loses historical context, because we're only making these judgments about these things being bad now with the benefit of hindsight, you know. And you have to actually understand people as they were thinking about things at the particular time they were they were living. And, you know, I think we lose that nuance, and like I say, you don't get a balance if history's just kind of becomes a source of evidence for moral stories, if you like, that we want to tell children in the present.
It's interesting you say that, because there was a question I was going to get to later, but I'll get to it now. So I'm part of what I call a Birmingham Salon, which would do like these debates. And I chaired a debate earlier this year, which was in defense of teaching history, it's private liberty. And one of the issues I said I had with it is it just focused on the history in the schools. And I said that there's history, the way we teach history is through our culture, first of all. That's, you can argue that's as big or as bigger in schools in many respects, but also through our families. So especially like war stories and whatnot. And I just wonder, as important as schools and universities are, do we take, kind of similar to what you said about the values, do we take into account the impact of, say, culture and our families, what we teach each other in terms of what we learn as a whole?
Yeah, I think this is really, really good question. And you know, it comes a bit like what I was saying about going to a Catholic school, but within a culture that was a bit different from that. I think schools, we forget sometimes, and I forget sometimes, you know, I sometimes find myself talking about schools as if they're kind of a little bubble that's kind of quite distinct from the rest of society. And they're not. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. So to use your example about history, I think you're absolutely right. You know, I think it would be a problem. It would still be a problem if schools were teaching this kind of relentlessly negative version of history, or even not teaching history at all. if outside of school, you know, you had vibrant museums which were really keeping alive the legacy of the past and had very kind of interesting exhibits that were drawing children in and kind of giving them detailed information, not just kind of hands-on activities that they could mess about with and then go again, or you know, even worse, giving them a kind of equally impoverished and negative view of the past, you know. But the fact is, history kind of is a live debate all around us. But again, it's this very negative thing, you know, it's which statues should we tear down, you know, which museum exhibits should we get rid of, you know, what artifacts from the past should we send back to different countries, you know, how should we feel guilty about British history today. So I think, you know, you've got this very kind of impoverished history teaching taking place, and it's within a broader culture where the past is also not respected and you know, considered to be only a negative thing. And it's very much the interaction of those two things together, which I think is really bad. And I think the point you make about families sharing stories about the past, that I think is such an interesting and such an important point, you know, because you're absolutely right that that was one way in which history became very important. But it's kind of, you know, you could say that, oh, well, your grandma and your grandpa, you know, they might still do that. They might still try and tell children about what life was like in the past. You know, I find myself doing it as a mother to my own children. But I guess it's school and the broader culture that kind of creates the response or helps shape how children are going to respond to hearing those stories. You know, our children, all children obviously are kind of like a bit rebellious towards the parents and the grandparents. That's kind of a given. But I guess when you're in a culture that's telling you that old people have got nothing to offer, you know, that everything they are associated with was bad and rubbish and not progressive and not worth listening to, then it creates this sense that you're just like, oh, you know, you're boring on again, you know, granddad, shut up, I don't want to know your war stories or whatever. Whereas if there was a kind of culture which had more respect for older people generally and history as well, then perhaps it would create more of a climate within families where young people wanted to hear those stories and were more respectful of those stories.
You mentioned earlier about the politicization of classrooms, very briefly. And I know some people have said about teachers become activists as well, as activists. Do you think some in the education profession have used education, or specifically our schools and universities, as another branch of activism?
I think they absolutely have. I mean, I have to say, you know, stress kind of not all teachers. I think there are, you know, no doubt a large proportion of teachers who, you know, literature teachers, for example, who do just love reading books and want to share their love of literature with children, or, you know, maths or physics or whatever it happens to be. You know, I'm absolutely convinced that there are, you know, a decent proportion of those teachers who are still out there. Unfortunately, I think their job, it's made harder for them to carry on doing this. But then I think you've got other subjects that are now a significant part of the school day. Subjects like personal social health education, relationships and sex education, and citizenship education. You know, a lot of these subjects which don't have that same kind of subject background. You know, I wonder, you know, about people who go into schools to be these kind of relationships and sex education teachers. So I guess I was one of these people. I didn't last very long, I'm embarrassed to admit, but I was one of these people who just really, really loved reading books. English had been my favourite subject at school. I did English at university, and when I left, I kind of thought, you know, what can I do? I'm not really qualified to do very much, but I really love reading and I loved being at school myself. And I would really love to kind of give other children that same interest in literature that I had, which to me kind of makes sense as a thought process that you'd end up teaching through kind of that chain of thought. So I find it really odd to think that there's people who think, well, you know, I really love relationships and sex. So do you know what? I'm really going to go into schools to teach kids all about relationships. Or, you know, I also find it very, very odd that you would think you're an expert in relationships and sex, because I can understand, you know, if you think, well, I've done a degree in English literature, you know, I've spent 10 years reading works of literature, you could think, do you know what, I think I do have something that I could teach children here. I'd count myself, you know, maybe expert's going too far, but I think I've learned a few things. Again, to think, you know, at what point, what qualifies someone to think that they're an expert in relationships and sex? I honestly, you know, as somebody who's coming up to 50, you know, and obviously has engaged in relationships as part of being human, I don't think I would ever say I'm sufficiently expert that I'm going to stand in front of a class of children and tell them all, you know, this is the right way to have a relationship, because I don't believe there is such a thing. I don't believe there's such a kind of right way to be doing these, to be human, to engage in relationships. So to me, it kind of suggests that if you are somebody who thinks, I think that I'm an expert in relationships, I think that there's the right way to have relationships, and my ambition in life is to go and tell children how to do relationships properly, then I think that does make you inherently political. You might deny it, you might kind of shy away from the label, but I think you can't teach about sex, gender, relationships without actually being a political activist. And, you know, many schools shy away from teaching it altogether and employ people from outside organisations, explicitly activist organisations, to come in and teach these lessons for them. So they're opening the door to political activists. So for me, you know, that is the number one, the most explicit way in which kind of politicization and values are taught nowadays, through these kind of contentless non-subjects that have no other purpose than to teach kids a political view of the world, of gender, of themselves, of relationships.
Doesn't that point to a wider problem in that what you've just described, those topics, they should be taught in families, those values in families? And actually a wider question needs to be asked, which is, why aren't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, because I think, you know, I like to think I've got a good sense of kind of morality, family values, but I don't think I was. I mean, probably like 99% of people in the world, you know, nobody sat me down and said, you know, now this is kind of how to be a good person. This is how to have a good relationship. You know, you're not, even in the context of families, you're not taught those things explicitly. You pick it up, you know, you learn from examples. And sometimes, to be very, very honest, you learn these things from bad examples. You know, you look, you know, sometimes they're, to be very personal for a second, you know, looked at my own parents' relationship and decided that was not how I wanted my life to be, you know, and you can consciously go and forge something different from yourself, but you're not learning these things in the same way that you're learning maths or literature. You're kind of imbibing from an ethos that's around you, like both from the good and the bad. And you know, I think obviously kids still do that, and families do still play that role. So then that begs the question, why are schools feeling the need to do that as well? And I think the problem is, you know, what you've just said to me, you know, why aren't families doing this? it's really refreshing to hear you say that, because there's so many times when I've argued against things like relationships and sex education, and people have looked at me absolutely horrified and said, what, you think school shouldn't be doing this? Oh my God, we can't just leave it to families. You know, what would happen? You know, you might be okay, you might be setting a good example for your children, but what about all those terrible families out there? You know, they wouldn't do this. They'd be, you know, it would all be abusive and terrible. And I think it reflects a really kind of low view that some of these activists have of ordinary people, where they think that kind of, it's not, I don't really like the phrase kind of ordinary people, but, you know, just the kind of regular family, the regular, you know, people who are just kind of muddling along with life, you know, not got any big political cause, just kind of getting by and living their regular lives, you know, that they can't be trusted to love their kids, essentially, is what they're saying. You know, they can't be trusted to bring their kids up with a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And that's the bottom line here. These activists think they've got to step in and do it because they know better than parents, and that left to their own devices, parents will teach their kids the wrong way. And you know what they often mean by that, quite explicitly, is that they will teach the wrong thing politically. You know, we might not all be sitting down, certainly I'm not sitting down and saying to my kids, you know, well, pass the salt with the dinner, and by the way, do you know there are 73 genders? And you know, that person who lives next door to us, you know, how dare you assume that she's a woman? You know, have you asked what her pronouns are? And so we're not all going through kind of giving these exact right political responses. And so that's what they really mean when they say people can't be trusted. They want to take over so that there's a kind of year zero blank slate, and they can be the ones to tell kids what they think are the correct views.
Earlier, well, there was a group of Asian American students who brought I think it was a class action against Harvard. We took them to the Supreme Court because they wanted to get into Harvard and they weren't allowed to, because from what I understand, I know people in the comments might correct me on this, but they had the grades to get into Harvard, but because of the quotas and whatnot, they couldn't. And then the Supreme Court basically have said affirmative action is no more. In regards to that, how do you feel about that, especially in universities? But also, again, going to another wider problem, which is, how do we measure achievement in schools and universities now? Is it based on merit, or is it based on identity and fairness?
No, good question. Well, I mean, you used the phrase earlier yourself, soft bigotry of low expectations. And to me, that there's no better phrase to sum up affirmative action. I mean, to me, what this is saying is that Black kids can't succeed academically without a hand up, you know, without being given extra points, you know, purely for their skin color. Now, this is not to say I think everything's absolutely perfect. And, you know, clearly there are some kids who have a lot of advantages going to private schools, you know, smaller class sizes, better qualified teachers, you know, a home environment that's perhaps more geared up for them being able to do schoolwork. You know, I wouldn't be so naive as to think that everything's completely equal. But when you start actually enshrining in law the idea that people need differential treatment based on their skin color, I think you actually risk, you know, maybe it was well intentioned to begin with, but I think you risk actually perpetuating racism. And I think to me, it just seems really patronizing, and I have the biggest problem with it, not for the Asian students who were not getting places, or white students who might miss out on places, but for Black students, because I think it must be very undermining of your confidence, because if you get a place, and I will be very honest, I've had similar experiences as a woman, You know, when you go and speak on a panel, for example, and I can look and see that all the men there have been asked to speak for no other reason than they've got something interesting to say. Not always, but there's been a few times where I've had a nagging suspicion I'm here because somebody's got a gender quota. You know, they want a woman here. And, you know, even if that's not true, you know, even if I've not personally been asked for that reason, knowing that there are people who are going to be cross if there's an all-male panel, or knowing that there's pressure for them to have women invited, you know, purely to make up a kind of gender equality, I find that kind of quite undermining, and it makes me question sometimes whether I'm on the basis of which I'm there. Is it really because they think I'm good enough? Is it really because they're interested in what I have to say? And I can only imagine that that must be the same for Black students who then do get invited to these top universities, selected to go to these top universities, who, you know, I'm sure no doubt have worked. You know, they're not, nobody's going to Harvard just on the basis of their skin color. Clearly, you know, these students have worked hard to get that place as well. But even if it's just a little doubt at the back of your mind that says, why am I here? Am I just as good as all the other students? Am I just as good as the white students? Am I just as good as the Asian students? I think that kind of doubt that it sows in your mind is really undermining, and really kind of undermines your confidence. And for that reason, I think it was a very, very bad thing. But like I said, I think in the broader cultural context, it promotes this idea that Black children, you know, are not as good and need an assistance, need a helping hand, which I think is very, very dangerous ground. So I was glad to see that overturned. So just remind me the second part of the question.
So how is education achieved now? Is it achieved
Oh yeah, no,
merit
it's a
or
good
for
question.
anxiety and fairness?
Yeah, I think it very much varies subject by subject. So I'm sure in, you know, more hard sciences, there is still an objective measure. You know, either you're going to know how to do maths and know how to do equations or not. And I think ultimately this is an epistemological question. It comes down to what we understand by the nature of knowledge and what we understand by the nature of truth in relation to particular subjects. So in perhaps in maths or in physics, and I'm sure no doubt you'll have mathematicians and people who study physics kind of telling me I've got this wrong. But, you know, I assume that there is more of an objective kind of standard that 2 + 2 = 4, you know, whether you're white or black, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you've got one leg or, you know, whatever, 2 + 2 will still equal 4, whatever day of the week it is or what. Whereas I think the problem with some of the social sciences and the humanities is they've much more given up on any kind of there was never, I guess, an objective sense of truth, but there could be more of a kind of socially agreed sense of truth or even beauty in some of the humanities subjects. Whereas when you kind of reject that concept and go down the line of truth is a matter of perspective, then, you know, you do then start saying, are all perspectives equally valid? And when you impose a social justice framework on that, you end up saying, well, not all perspectives are equally valid. You know, that perhaps the perspective of more disadvantaged groups, whether that's women in the context of gender studies, or transgender people in the context of gender studies, or Black people in the context of critical race theory, you know, they have more of a truth, more of a handle on the truth than other groups. And so their perspective is more valid and counts for more. But that means very much in terms of your question, you know, you're not being assessed on kind of what you know in any objective sense, but your identity does then form the basis. And I think what's really interesting is that you then see this in relation to some academics, particularly in Canada and America, who kind of create these false identities for themselves, kind of Indigenous identities, because they're aware it's not just undergraduates who get treated in this way, but their own kind of academic careers, the papers that they write, the conferences that they attend, they are being judged on their identity as much as on what they have to say, or rather what they have to say is being judged on the basis of their identity, first and foremost. So presenting themselves as having this kind of Indigenous or minority identity adds extra weight and value to who they are. But the whole thing becomes a kind of a performance, and it makes a mockery, really, of proper academic study, as far as I'm concerned.
Joanna Williams, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm going to leave some of your articles from Spiked. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Where else can we find your work?
So you could go to Cieo, cieo.org.uk and have a look there, or like I say, have a look on Spiked. I've nearly always got a current article up on Spiked. But it's been really great to talk to you, Chris, and I'm sorry we've had to cut it a little bit short this evening, but if you want to have me back, it's been such a pleasure. Very happy to come back on another time if there's any more questions to talk about. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I know you have to go now, so we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for being on the 286 project.
Brilliant, thank you.